Hey, so this might very well be the most boring DCS World video you have ever seen, unless you are into analyzing flight performance data of aircraft. What I did is I took a look at the flight model of the L39C, not a comparison to the real aircraft, just a look at DCS World's L39C aircraft, and gathered some performance data. So the first thing that I did is I accelerated the aircraft from stall speed up to its maximum speed. So this is what I got. From stall speed at around 60 meters per second, throttled full forward, maximum rated thrust. It took 160 seconds to reach an equilibrium, pretty much equilibrium airspeed at 220 meters per second. And at any given point in time, I noted the true airspeed. So knowing your true airspeed is nice, but knowing how it changes is a lot more interesting. So I calculated the acceleration, so the change in true airspeed over true airspeed. So, for example, when I passed a speed of 100 meters per second, I had an acceleration of about 2.2 meters per second square, and as I accelerated, that speed dropped down to almost zero when approaching the maximum airspeed. And that's really interesting. And you see these ups and downs, these mountains and valleys in the graph. And I asked myself where that came from. And it was most prominently because I was climbing and descending ever so slightly. So I measured the climb gradient, and that's it. I measured my climb gradient during that test flight. And for example, when I passed this speed, I was descending slightly. When I passed this speed, I was climbing slightly. And I converted this climb gradient into an acceleration. So I basically asked myself, well, how much more could I have accelerated if I hadn't climbed here or descended here? And I converted that into an acceleration and subtracted it from the initial graph, and I got this. This is the initial curve, uncorrected, and this is the corrected version. As you can see, it's a lot smoother, and it's a lot easier to work with. Please also note that from now on, the acceleration that I measured is actually called the climb gradient, because a climb gradient is nothing but an acceleration against Earth gravity. So you can convert from a climb gradient to an acceleration back and forth. Physically speaking, they're equivalent. I still could have corrected for some more errors, for example, an uneven G-load or flight control surface deflections, but I would have to make some very wild guesses to do that. So I stuck with this. The next thing I did was I basically asked Excel, hey, please give me a function that describes this curve as best as you can. And what it came up with is a sixth order polynomial, which is way good enough for me to get the shape that I wanted. It's a very smoothed out curve version, and this is exactly the curve that I expected to get, which is perfectly fine. So what it tells me is if you want to achieve the maximum climb gradient, you can achieve it at a speed of about 65 meters per second. Keep in mind that is for an L39C at this weight in clean configuration very close to the ground. So the climb gradient, it's nice to know this, but what's even more interesting is your climb rate. So let's just multiply each and every one of these dots with the respective true airspeed. So if I have that climb gradient, then I multiply it with 100 meters per second, then I get the climb rate in meters per second. And that's what this is. That's your climb rate in meters per second over true airspeed. So what it tells me is if I fly this airspeed in this aircraft at max rate thrust, I can get a climb performance of about 22 meters per second. So there are some interesting points along this graph. First of all, the best climb rate, so the maximum amount of altitude climbed per time, can be achieved at a speed of about 120, 125 meters per second. Somewhere around here, you get the maximum climb rate. But if you want to achieve the maximum climb gradient, like the maximum amount of altitude over the shortest possible distance, then you can take the origin here, draw a tangent line, and you end up somewhere around here. That gives you the airspeed where you can get the maximum climb gradient out of it. And if I go back to the previous page, then, ooh, what a surprise. That's exactly where this graph has its maximum. That's where this graph has its tangent line. So you have this airspeed to get the maximum climb rate and this airspeed to get the maximum climb gradient out of the aircraft. Well, this might change with altitude. The values will go down. Climb performance will not be as good. And because the air is getting thinner, this entire curve will shift over towards higher true airspeeds, but pretty much constant indicated airspeeds if you do the same test in higher altitudes. And that's probably also interesting to do. But for starters, I just took the climb performance in very low level. So that's basically what you would do to calculate takeoff performance in a real life aircraft. I hope this was somewhat interesting to you. If you want to take some fun benefit out of it, then you could basically bet with your friend who gathers the most altitude per distance or the most altitude per time in an L39C. And I can promise you, if you fly these speeds like at 120 meters per second or around about 65 meters per second, you will get the best climb rate and best performance. There's no way anyone could ever beat you at this game if you use that performance data in this aircraft configuration. So I hope you enjoyed this rather short insight into the L39C. There's a lot more to learn, but I will save that for another video. So keep enjoying flying and see you next time.